President Donald Trump locked eyes with Chairman Xi inside the stifling Hall of Supreme Harmony, preparing to deliver a brutal truth that would tear the globalist narrative to shreds. Do you realize what the supreme leader of Iran and a severely overcooked piece of fried chicken have in common, Chairman? The question lingered in the room, heavy and piercing, slicing straight through the suffocating quiet of the hall. It certainly wasn't the type of opening remark you would ever discover tucked inside a State Department briefing binder. It was far from the sanitized, focus group-tested garbage that the Washington establishment had been spoon-feeding the American public for decades. This was raw and unfiltered. This was a calculated detonation high above the sprawling, ancient courtyards of the Forbidden City. The afternoon sun was slowly bleeding out, casting a deceptive golden glow across the curved rooftops, attempting to project a warmth that simply did not exist within those walls. Down below, far beyond the heavy wooden doors, the state-run media cameras remained locked in position. They were filming what they assumed would be a completely standard, predictable summit. They expected a polite exchange of diplomatic pleasantries, a manufactured photo op designed purely to soothe anxious global markets. They fully expected the American president to play along with the unwritten, cowardly rules of globalist etiquette. But up here on this private balcony, stripped of the handlers and the yes-men, the atmosphere was as freezing and unforgiving as a maximum security interrogation room. The only sound attempting to fill the heavy void was the delicate, steady dripping of premium pu'er tea being poured into a porcelain cup. Drip, 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 every single drop felt loud enough to shatter the glass. A sharp observer, someone not blinded by the relentless brainwashing of the mainstream media, would immediately spot the stark contrast between the two men seated across the narrow wooden table. On one side sat the American president, draped in his signature navy blue suit. It was a garment that projected undeniable economic muscle, unapologetic capitalism, and the exact kind of raw, practical power that built the modern world. He sat leaning slightly forward, his posture loose but inherently predatory. He was the absolute, living embodiment of a nation that was finally finished apologizing for its own greatness. Directly across from him sat the chairman, fastened tightly into a traditional dark Mao suit. It was an outfit carefully tailored to project unity, continuity, and the quiet, creeping dominance of a regime that had spent years quietly buying up the globe. They had been purchasing the world while America's political class intentionally looked the other way, too busy lining their own pockets to even notice the looming threat. Right now, however, the host was entirely motionless. His face was a masterclass in stoicism, resembling a stone monument that had successfully weathered centuries of storms. Yet behind those narrow, unblinking eyes, a furious calculation was actively taking place. Silence was the absolute last weapon the host had left. It was a tactic that had worked flawlessly against the weak, accommodating politicians of past eras. The globalist elites, those career bureaucrats crawling out of the swamp, would usually sprint to fill a dead silence exactly like this one. They would be terrified of causing offense, eager to offer up a shiny concession just to keep the conversation moving and protect their precious international norms. But Donald Trump did not flinch for a second. He let the silence stretch out. He let it wrap tightly around the chairman's neck like a constricting wire. He was in absolutely no rush. The president leaned back just slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching upward into a knowing, highly dangerous smirk. They are both completely done. The words dropped like a heavy hammer striking an anvil, and nobody can swallow something that burnt. He didn't wait for a translator to soften the blow. He didn't pause for a frightened diplomat to rephrase the statement into something far more palatable for the international press corps. He stared straight into the eyes of the man who had bankrolled the very enemies that America was currently tearing apart. And that, Mr. Chairman, is exactly what happens when you try to blackmail the United States of America with a mountain of garbage missiles. There it was, the undeniable truth that the left-wing media conglomerates back in New York and Washington had been desperately attempting to bury for months on end. The talking heads on the legacy networks had been relentlessly spinning a narrative of pure fear. They told the American public that standing up to Tehran would instantly ignite World War III. They warned that putting America first would somehow isolate us, and that showing actual strength was a moral failing. They wanted the masses to believe that the Iranian regime was a formidable, terrifying force. They wanted you to believe that the only viable solution was to appease them with massive pallets of untraceable cash alongside disastrous, one-sided nuclear deals. But sitting right there on that balcony, thousands of miles away from the treacherous Beltway, the president was aggressively stripping away the illusion. He was exposing the hollow core of the enemy, and he was doing it right to the face of their biggest global sponsor. The chairman finally moved his hands, slowly reaching for his teacup in a deliberate, highly controlled gesture designed to mask the sheer shock of the frontal assault. You have a very unconventional way of opening a dialogue. Mr. President, his voice was smooth, carrying the translated weight of an ancient empire. But there was an unmistakable edge of tension lurking beneath the surface, a slight, noticeable crack in the porcelain facade. Unconventional. The president let out a low, raspy chuckle that held absolutely zero warmth. I call it cutting right through the nonsense. We can sit here and talk about bilateral cooperation and mutual respect until the sun comes up tomorrow. We can smile brightly for the cameras and pretend that everything is perfectly fine. But you and I both know exactly why we are really sitting at this table. You thought your friends in the Middle East had us completely cornered. You thought they could build up a massive stockpile of ballistic and cruise missiles, hide them away in caves, and use them as a geopolitical shield. The plan was incredibly simple, wasn't it? They were going to mass-produce cheap drones, jack up their military production, and then pivot to face the rest of the world. They were going to turn to us, turn to Israel, and announce that they were rapidly restarting their nuclear weapons program. They thought they could threaten to destroy the entire region. They genuinely thought they could threaten to drop warheads on London, Paris, and Berlin if we dared to step in and stop them. The president leaned forward once again, tapping a single authoritative finger firmly on the wooden table. But they miscalculated, and frankly, Chairman, so did you, if you ever thought I was going to let that happen on my watch. Think about what the deep state desperately wanted in this exact scenario. They wanted endless, paralyzing negotiations. They wanted to empower globalist institutions like the UN to issue strongly worded letters while our enemies happily armed themselves to the teeth. They hated this president, not because he was crude, but because he absolutely refused to play their rigged game. He refused to pretend that the emperor was actually wearing clothes. He bypassed their entire corrupt system, and right now, he was proving exactly why he had to do it. The supreme leader is gone, the president continued, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the absolute certainty of a man who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. And the infrastructure that supported his little extortion ring, it is currently sitting in smoking ruins. The chairman took a slow, calculated sip of his tea, his eyes never leaving the president's face. He was aggressively searching for a crack in the armor. He was looking for a sign of bluffing, a hint of the typical Western insecurity he was so accustomed to exploiting in his dealings with previous administrations. He found absolutely none. The world is a complex place, President Trump. Power is not always measured by what you destroy. Sometimes it is measured by what you build and who you build it with. It was a classic, heavily calculated deflection. It was a clear pivot to the long game, an attempt to steer the conversation back toward the safe harbor of diplomatic ambiguity. But the president was a sheer master of controlling the pace of the room. He wasn't going to let the chairman retreat into philosophical riddles. He was going to nail him to the wall with hard facts. Let me tell you about what is being built right now in Iran. Absolutely nothing, because you cannot build anything when your entire society is in a total, unrecoverable freefall. The president let the harsh reality of the situation hang in the air. He was forcing the chairman to confront the failed investment his country had made, forcing him to look directly at the wreckage of his geopolitical chess piece. This was the exact moment the deep state back home dreaded above all else. This was the unvarnished truth that completely shattered their carefully crafted narrative of American weakness and inevitable decline. The left-wing politicians and their media lapdogs would have you believe that the situation was merely a stalemate. They would go on Sunday morning television and confidently declare that the America First agenda had somehow backfired. But here was the commander-in-chief, sitting right in the heart of Beijing, laying out the undeniable, brutal metrics of victory. It was a victory achieved not by endless, bloody occupation, but by overwhelming, targeted economic and military leverage. And the man sitting across from him knew it all too well. The chairman knew that the proxies he relied on to distract the United States were being systematically dismantled. He knew that the era of American appeasement, the era of apologizing for simply existing, was definitively over. The silence returned to the balcony, but it was no longer the chairman's weapon, it belonged entirely to the president. He sat there, bathed in the fading light, letting the reality of the fried chicken analogy sink deep into the bones of the globalist agenda. He had perfectly set the hook. He had destroyed the false premise that America's enemies were invincible. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the courtyards into deep shadow, the real battle was just beginning. The president had laid out the corpse of the Iranian threat right on the table. Now, he was waiting for the chairman to make his next move. He was waiting for the inevitable counterattack, that desperate play the globalists always tried to make when backed firmly into a corner. He knew the chairman had a card hidden up his sleeve, a card handed to him by a weak, compromising ally over in Europe. But what the chairman didn't know, what the deep state didn't know, was that the president had already rigged the deck. The game was on, and the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the free world. The dying sun cast a blood-orange glare across the polished rosewood table, illuminating the dust motes that hung frozen in the suffocating air of the Forbidden City. This was the kind of table where, for decades, globalist politicians had quietly sold out hard-working American citizens over polite cups of tea. They would come here, smile for the cameras, recite their carefully scripted apologies for American exceptionalism, and sign away our geopolitical leverage. But not today. Today, that ancient rosewood table was an executioner's block, and the man in the navy blue suit was firmly holding the axe. We are stepping right behind the heavily guarded doors of May 14th, 2026, straight into the most consequential diplomatic showdown of our lifetime. The mainstream media will never tell you the real truth about what happened in that room because the truth completely shatters their entire worldview. They have spent years trying to convince you that the Iranian regime is a sophisticated, terrifying military juggernaut that must be appeased at all costs. They wanted you terrified of the mullahs so they could easily justify sending them pallets of untraceable cash in the middle of the night. But sitting across from the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, President Trump was about to rip the mask completely off that lie. He was about to lay out a devastating indictment of a proxy empire that had been utterly annihilated by the America First agenda. The president leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking slightly, a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room. You know, Chairman, the experts in Washington love to use big words to describe your friends in Tehran. They talk about asymmetric warfare and regional hegemony. But let me give you a term from Louisiana, a term real Americans easily understand. Right now, both the public and the private sector in Iran are being held together with spit and duct tape. Let that sink in. Spit and duct tape. It is brilliant, it is crude, and it is brutally accurate. The State Department snobs would faint if they ever heard language like that. But that is exactly why the American people elected this man. He cuts right through the bureaucratic fog and delivers the unvarnished reality directly to the people who think they own the world. The chairman's eyes flickered the tiniest crack in his stone-cold demeanor as he processed the sheer disrespect of the metaphor. He was used to dealing with weak European leaders who trembled at the mere thought of offending him. He was certainly not used to an American president who looked at his multi-billion-dollar Middle Eastern investment and called it a junkyard. Spit and duct tape is not a doctrinal military term, Mr. President, the chairman finally replied, his voice a low, calculated hum. No, it's a reality term. The president shot back instantly, not giving him an inch of breathing room. Let's look at the numbers, because I know you love numbers, Chairman. 7 out of 10 Iranians are currently out of work. 7 out of 10. That is not an economy, that is a graveyard. You backed a regime that promised to wipe us off the map, and now they cannot even put bread on the table for their own citizens. We bombed their infrastructure straight back into the Stone Age. We hit the targets that actually mattered, the ones the weak politicians in my country were always too terrified to touch. And what is the result? They are drowning in 70% inflation. Think about that for a second. 70% inflation. The mainstream media anchors in New York City loudly complain when their expensive lattes go up by 50 cents. Yet they wanted to empower a regime that has impoverished an entire nation. The Iranian currency is basically worthless, completely decimated by the relentless, crushing weight of maximum pressure sanctions. And when the people realize they are starving while the elites steal their money, the president continued, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. The regime panics. Their internet is shut off. They have to plunge their entire country into digital darkness just to stop the truth from getting out. A government that has to turn off the lights to survive is not a government you should be betting on, Chairman. The president was methodically dismantling the illusion of the Chinese-Iranian alliance piece by piece. He was exposing the undeniable fact that Beijing had anchored itself to a rapidly sinking ship, but he wasn't done yet. He was about to move from the economic devastation to the sheer military humiliation. This is the part that the Pentagon bureaucrats tried to hide from you, the part the Democrats desperately want you to ignore. You know better than anyone what we have done on the military side, the president said, spreading his hands flat on the table, because I am completely sure your intelligence agencies watched it happen in real time. Their launchers? Gone. Those fancy ballistic missiles they love to parade around Tehran? For the most part, completely gone. Their drone production facilities? Vaporized. The factories that were supposed to build the swarm that would overwhelm our defenses are nothing but smoking craters in the desert. The chairman shifted his weight ever so slightly, a microscopic tell that the president was hitting the exact nerve. This was not just an attack on Iran, it was a direct attack on the Chinese technology and funding that had built that military apparatus in the first place. And let's talk about their conventional forces, the president said, a grim smile playing on his lips. Their navy? Gone. It's sent to the bottom of the ocean. Their air force? Gone. It is a complete and total military degradation. This is the absolute crux of the matter. For years, the left told us that if we stood up to these tyrants, we would be dragged into a massive, bloody ground war. They told us it was physically impossible to degrade an enemy's capabilities without sacrificing thousands of American lives. But the president proved them completely wrong. He used precise precision. He used overwhelming technological superiority. And he used the sheer, terrifying threat of American resolve. He didn't need to put boots on the ground to wipe out their navy. He just needed to give the decisive order that the previous administrations were too cowardly to give. I could get in an airplane right now, the president told the chairman, his eyes burning with absolute conviction. I personally could fly anywhere I want to across the entire country of Iran right now and feel completely safe. Do you know why? Because they do not have any air defenses left. We took them all out. They are completely naked from the sky. Imagine the absolute shockwaves traveling through the chairman's mind at this precise moment. The American president is sitting right in Beijing, taunting him with the fact that his greatest proxy army is completely defenseless. It is an unprecedented display of dominance. The intelligence is public, the president stated, leaning back and crossing his arms. It will be, in my opinion, at least 20 years and cost $1 trillion before they are even somewhat back to normal. $1 trillion. And I do not have the slightest idea where they are going to get the money. He let the number hang heavily in the air, a massive, unpayable debt resting entirely on the chairman's shoulders. If they think China is going to give it to them, or if they think Russia has the cash to bail them out, they are going to learn a very hard lesson. They are bankrupt. Half of their oil fields are low pressure. Once they shut them down, they are never getting them back up. The blockade is tight. Nothing is going in, and nothing is coming out. We have achieved our objective. We ensured they will never get a nuclear weapon because they no longer have a functioning country to build one in. This is the harsh reality of the America First doctrine. It is not about starting wars, it is about ending them before they begin by making the cost of crossing us absolutely unimaginable. The left wants you to feel sorry for the regime. The globalists desperately want you to believe that this level of destruction is somehow unfair or disproportionate. But out in the real world, out where the wolves roam, the only thing that guarantees peace is the total, undeniable destruction of your enemy's capacity to do harm. The chairman looked at the president, his mask of indifference finally showing true signs of cracking under the relentless barrage of facts. He knew that everything the American was saying was absolutely true. The Iranian gambit had failed miserably. The spit and duct tape empire had collapsed under the sheer weight of an American leader who actually loved his country enough to defend it. But the chairman was a survivor, a man who had ruthlessly climbed to the top of a communist machine. He was not going to surrender without playing his final card. He took a slow, deliberate breath, adjusting his cuffs as he prepared to pivot away from the smoking ruins of the Middle East. He was going to try and change the battlefield. He was going to look toward the Indian Ocean, toward a small island called Diego Garcia, and toward a weak British Prime Minister named Keir Starmer. The chairman thought he had a secret weapon, a backroom deal that the globalists had handed him on a silver platter. But as we are about to find out, the deep state's little insurance policy was already dead on arrival. The president had already seen the play, and he had already changed the locks. The air in the Forbidden City was growing heavier by the minute, not from the humidity of the impending Beijing summer, but from the crushing, undeniable weight of American dominance. We are witnessing a front-row seat to the greatest diplomatic dismantling of the 21st century inside that room. The commander-in-chief sits across from the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, and he is not blinking. He has just laid out the absolute devastation of the Iranian regime. He has just painted a picture of a nation held together by nothing more than spit and duct tape, its military vaporized, its economy suffocating under the weight of 70% inflation. He has proven that the America First doctrine is not just a slogan, it is a lethal, precise instrument of global reality. But now the president is about to pivot. He is about to transition from the enemies abroad to the enemies within. Because the hardest battles are not always fought in the deserts of the Middle East or the waters of the South China Sea. The most treacherous battles are fought right in the heart of Washington, D.C. They are fought against a permanent political class, a deeply entrenched swamp, and a mainstream media apparatus that operates exactly as the propaganda wing of the globalist elite. The president leaned back in his intricately carved wooden chair, letting the brutal facts about Iran settle over the table. He watched the chairman. He watched the subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of the chairman's jaw. The chairman is a man who relies heavily on perception, on the illusion of strength, and the president had just shattered that illusion completely. A faint, almost mocking smile played on the president's lips. He knew exactly what the chairman was thinking. He knew that the chairman, like every other dictator around the world, had been glued to CNN, MSNBC, and the pages of the New York Times. They watch our legacy media to gauge our national resolve, and what they see is a constant, pathetic stream of self-loathing and manufactured division. You know, Chairman, the president began, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost conspiratorial tone. I watch the news just like you do, and I know what my Democratic friends back home are trying to say. They are running around Capitol Hill, they re-sitting in their fancy television studios, and they are trying to say, we have lost. This is the absolute definition of psychological warfare. The president is taking the very talking points that the Chinese Communist Party hopes to exploit, and he is dragging them out into the daylight. He is acknowledging the internal division of the United States, but he is doing it to show that he is completely immune to it. He is looking at the chairman and saying, I know you see the cracks in my armor, but those cracks are painted on by liars. They are trying to tell the world that our strategy has failed. The president continued, his eyes locking onto the chairman with the intensity of a laser. They want everyone to believe that holding all the cards is somehow a strategic blunder. But you know they are lying, right? The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. The chairman did not answer. He could not answer. To agree would be to admit that the American media was a joke, and to disagree would be to deny the smoking ruins of his Iranian proxy. He was trapped securely in the president's rhetorical cage. They know exactly what we have accomplished, the president said, his voice hardening, the casual tone replaced by a cold, righteous anger. They have the same classified briefings that I do. They see the satellite imagery. They know the strait is secure. They know the oil fields are shutting down. And they know the mullahs are begging for mercy in the dark. But they will never admit it on camera. This is the sickness of the deep state. This is the cancer eating away at the foundation of our great republic. We have a political faction in this country that is so consumed by its own thirst for power, so blinded by its irrational hatred for one man, that they are willing to actively sabotage American foreign policy. They hate me more than they love America, the president stated. The words echoed off the ancient, tapestried walls of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. They hate me more than they love America. Let that sentence sink deep into your bones. It is the tragic, undeniable truth of the modern Democratic Party and their lapdogs in the legacy media. They would rather see the United States humiliated on the world stage than see Donald J. Trump secure a historic victory. They would rather see a terrorist-sponsoring state acquire a nuclear weapon than admit that the America First agenda kept the world safe. That is exactly why they hide the truth that Iran is on its knees, the president said, driving the final nail into the coffin of the media narrative. They have to hide it because if the American people truly understood what we have done, if they saw the actual results of having a commander-in-chief who doesn't bow and doesn't apologize, the swamp would be drained overnight. The politicians would be out of a job, and the pundits would have absolutely nothing left to talk about. The chairman slowly reached for his cup of tea, a calculated movement to buy himself a fraction of a second to process this massive onslaught. He was witnessing something he fundamentally could not understand. In his country, the media exists solely to project the absolute, unquestionable power of the state. The idea of a domestic press corps actively working to undermine their own national security for partisan gain was a uniquely Western disease. But the chairman also recognized something else. He recognized that the man sitting across from him was entirely unconstrained by that corrupt system. The president was not afraid of the bad headlines. He was not going to moderate his behavior to win the approval of the Washington Post editorial board. He was operating on a completely different frequency, dealing entirely in the currency of raw, unvarnished power. Your internal politics are complicated, Mr. President, the chairman finally murmured, offering a vague, non-committal diplomatic platitude. There is nothing complicated about it, Chairman. The president shot back instantly. It is very simple. They want to surrender, and I refuse to let them. They want to hand over the keys to the kingdom because it makes them feel sophisticated at their little cocktail parties. But I do not care about their cocktail parties, I care about reality. And the reality is that the people who bet against the United States are currently bankrupt, disarmed, and irrelevant. This is the moment of absolute clarity. This is the message that the globalists are terrified you will hear. They want you to think that their endless compromises and their terrible deals are the only way to manage the world. They want you to think that strong leadership is dangerous. But what is truly dangerous is weakness. What is truly dangerous is a political class that values the applause of foreign bureaucrats more than the security of their own citizens. The president was sitting in the Forbidden City, exposing the ultimate betrayal. He was showing the chairman that the division in America was not a sign of a crumbling empire, but a symptom of a desperate, dying political establishment that was losing its grip on the narrative. You see, Chairman, the president said, clasping his hands together and resting them on the table, the people who run the television networks back home, the people who write the think tank reports, they live in a bubble. They think their words can change the facts on the ground. They think that if they say we are losing loudly enough, it will magically become true. But words do not shoot down missiles. Words do not restart low-pressure oil fields. And words certainly do not intimidate me. My Democratic friends can scream into the void all they want. They can hold their hearings, they can leak their fake stories to their favorite reporters, and they can try to convince the world that the sky is falling. But when the dust settles, they still have to wake up in a world that I have secured. They still have to live under the umbrella of safety that my administration has built, whether they have the integrity to admit it or not. The chairman remained silent. He was a master of the long game, a man who thought in terms of decades and centuries, not simple election cycles. He had always counted on the short attention span of the American public and the cowardly nature of American politicians to further his goals. He had always assumed that if he just waited long enough, the internal divisions of the United States would paralyze its foreign policy. But Donald Trump was rewriting the rules of the game right in front of him. Trump was taking that internal division, acknowledging it, mocking it, and completely neutralizing it as a strategic factor. He was telling Beijing, "Do not mistake the noise of my political enemies for the policy of the United States government. I am the policy. I am the one holding the cards, and I am the one making the deals. So let them talk," the president concluded, leaning back and giving the chairman a look of absolute, unshakable confidence. "Let them say whatever they want, because at the end of the day, you and I both know the truth. You know that Iran is finished. You know that the era of American appeasement is dead and buried. And you know that the people who hate me more than they love our country are completely powerless to stop what is coming next." The shadows in the room were growing longer, the golden hour fading into a deep, serious twilight. The president had systematically destroyed the chairman's Middle Eastern strategy, and he had completely stripped away the illusion of American vulnerability. He had exposed the treasonous nature of the globalist press, and he had established total psychological dominance over the conversation. But the chairman was not the leader of a global superpower for nothing. He was bleeding, his strategies were fully exposed, but he still had one card left to play. He still had that little secret deal in the Indian Ocean. He still had the weakness of the British government to rely on. He thought he had an ace in the hole, a backdoor way to humiliate the United States and establish a foothold in a critical strategic corridor. He was about to pivot to Diego Garcia. He was about to try and use the cowardice of Prime Minister Keir Starmer to counter the strength of the American president. But the chairman had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him. He had no idea that he was walking straight into a trap that the ultimate dealmaker had set weeks ago. The deep state thought they had outsmarted us. The globalists thought they had secured a victory. But they forgot one crucial detail. They forgot exactly who they were dealing with. The shadows stretching across the polished rosewood table were no longer just the product of the setting sun. They were the visual representation of a shifting battlefield. We are witnessing the most intense, high-stakes diplomatic poker game in modern history. The American president has just taken a sledgehammer to the Chinese chairman's Middle Eastern strategy. He has laid out the undeniable, humiliating facts about the total collapse of the Iranian proxy regime. He has exposed the spit and duct tape reality of their military, and he has completely dismissed the frantic America Last propaganda being peddled by the left-wing legacy media back home. The president has cornered the dragon. But here is the thing about cornered dragons: they do not just roll over and surrender. They lash out. They look for a weak spot. And if they cannot find one in the armor of the American president, they look for one in the soft, rotting underbelly of our so-called allies. They look for the globalists. The chairman sat perfectly still, absorbing the brutal reality of the president's words. His Middle Eastern investment was gone, his proxy army was defanged, and his attempt to use American domestic division as leverage had failed completely. For a fraction of a second, the room was so quiet you could hear the ancient timbers of the Hall of Supreme Harmony settling. And then it happened. A faint, chilling smile began to form on the chairman's face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the cold, calculated smirk of a bureaucrat who knows he has a secret ace hidden up his sleeve. It was the smile of a man who firmly believes he has just found the ultimate loophole in the American defense perimeter. This is exactly how the minds of these global adversaries operate. They know they cannot beat us in a direct, head-to-head confrontation of strength, economic might, or military firepower. So what do? They carefully exploit the weakness of the international system. They exploit the cowardice of politicians who care far more about looking good at international summits than they care about national security. And right now, the chairman was about to exploit the absolute, staggering incompetence of the British government. He was about to play the Diego Garcia card. Now, for those who might not have a map of the Indian Ocean pinned to their wall, Diego Garcia is a tiny, horseshoe-shaped footprint in the middle of nowhere. But do not let its size fool you. It is one of the most critical, highly classified, absolutely essential strategic military locations on the face of the earth. It is the tip of the American spear. It is where our long-range bombers take off, it is where our submarines dock, and it is the anchor that secures the entire region against the expansionist fantasies of the Chinese Communist Party. Without Diego Garcia, our ability to operate in that hemisphere is severely crippled, and the British, in their infinite progressive wisdom, technically own the Chagos Islands where this base is located. For decades, we have operated there under a rock-solid agreement, but then the globalists took over in London. Then came Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Prime Minister Starmer, a man so desperate for the approval of the international elites that he decided to just give the islands away. He decided to hand them over to a country called Mauritius, a country that, historically speaking, has virtually no real connection to the Chagos Islands whatsoever. But do you know who Mauritius does have a connection with? Do you know who their new best friends are? Beijing. They are BFFs, or whatever the young people call it these days. The chairman knew this. He had orchestrated it. He had watched the British Prime Minister fold like a cheap lawn chair, and he had been waiting for this exact moment to rub it in the American president's face. The chairman slowly reached out and adjusted the cuffs of his dark Mao suit. He looked across the rosewood table, the faint smile now fixed permanently on his features. He believed he was about to deliver a fatal blow to the America First agenda. "The world is a very large chessboard, Mr. President," the chairman said, his voice dropping to a smooth, patronizing hum. "And while you have been entirely focused on the ashes of the Middle East, it seems the tides have shifted in the Indian Ocean." The president did not blink. He just watched the chairman, his eyes narrowed, waiting for the punchline he already knew was coming. "I am sure you are aware of the recent diplomatic triumphs of your closest ally," the chairman continued, relishing every single syllable. "Prime Minister Starmer is a very progressive thinker. He understands that the era of Western colonialism is over, and he understands the importance of returning territory to its rightful owners. Listen to the language they use. They use the language of social justice. They use the guilt-tripping rhetoric of the radical left to justify a massive surrender of military power. They dress up a geopolitical disaster in the clothing of historical equity. And the worst part is the establishment politicians fall for it every single time. They are so terrified of being called names by the international press that they will literally hand the keys to the castle over to our greatest adversary. Mauritius is a beautiful country," the chairman said, leaning slightly forward, "and they are very good friends of ours. We have a deep bilateral relationship. We build their infrastructure, we support their economy, and in return they offer us a level of cooperation that is unprecedented." The chairman was not just talking, he was boasting. He was outlining the exact blueprint of how the deep state sells out the free world. He was laying out the fact that he did not have to fire a single shot to compromise one of the most important American military installations on the planet. He just had to wait for a weak, left-wing politician in Europe to sign a piece of paper. "So you see, Mr. President," the chairman concluded, locking eyes with the commander-in-chief, "you might win in the Middle East, but in the Indian Ocean, Mr. Starmer has already gifted us the spare key to Diego Garcia." There it was, the counterattack, the ultimate trump card that the globalists had handed to the Chinese Communist Party, wrapped in a neat little bow. The chairman sat back, the faint smile now a look of total, arrogant triumph. He believed he had won the summit. He believed he had proven that American strength could always be bypassed by European weakness. He thought he had just secured a permanent docking station for his naval fleet right next door to our classified bombers. Imagine the sheer audacity of this moment. Imagine sitting across from the leader of the free world and telling him that his own allies had just sold him out. The mainstream media would have you believe that this is just how diplomacy works. They would tell you that we just have to accept this new reality, that we have to share the ocean, that we cannot be bullies about our military bases. They would have you believe that Prime Minister Starmer made a noble, moral decision. But the truth is known. As the president himself has stated, there have been some pretty bad deals made by the Brits, especially when it pertains to Diego Garcia. It was a terrible deal. It was a deal that would place extreme limitations on how our troops could face threats and how we could use that island. It was a surrender. and the chairman thought the President of the United States was bound by that surrender. He thought that because a piece of paper was signed in London, the American military was just going to pack up its bags, hand over the spare key, and let Beijing set up shop in the Indian Ocean. He thought he was dealing with a traditional politician. He thought he was dealing with someone who respected the bureaucratic nonsense of the international rules-based order more than he respected the safety and security of the American people. The silence returned to the balcony, but it was a completely different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a trap springing shut. The chairman thought he was the one springing the trap. He thought he had the American president completely boxed in. But what the chairman failed to realize, what the entire globalist establishment constantly fails to realize, is that DonaldJ.com, Trump does not play by their rules. He does not accept bad deals just because someone else signed them. He does not respect treaties that compromise American sovereignty. And he certainly does not let a weak prime minister in London dictate the military posture of the United States of America. The chairman's smile lingered. A monument to the arrogance of the international elite. He was waiting for the president to flinch. He was waiting for the president to show a sign of frustration, a sign of defeat. He was waiting for the president to start talking about managing the transition or seeking bilateral working groups to address the security concerns. But the president just sat there. He looked at the chairman's smug, satisfied face. He looked at the man who thought he had just outsmarted the greatest deal-maker on earth. And the president did not flinch. He did not scowl. He did not raise his voice. Instead, a different kind of expression began to form on the president's face. It was not a smile. It was the cold, hard look of a landlord who was about to evict a very problematic tenant. The chairman had laid his biggest card on the table. He had played the Diego Garcia spare key. But the game was not over. In fact, the real lesson in American power was just about to begin. Because what the chairman was about to find out, and what the whole world was about to find out, is that having a spare key does not mean a single, solitary thing if the locks have already been changed. The Forbidden City was sinking into a deep, bruised purple as the sun finally surrendered to the horizon. Up on that balcony, the air didn't just feel cold, it felt electrified, like the moments right before a lightning strike hits the ground. The chairman sat there with that smug, self-satisfied grin, thinking he had just delivered the knockout blow. He really believed that a weak-kneed globalist politician in London had handed him the keys to the kingdom. He thought that by manipulating the guilt-ridden conscience of the British establishment, he had successfully bypassed the American military. He thought he had outsmarted the man in the navy blue suit, but any sharp observer who knows exactly how the deep state operates could see the reality. They could see that the chairman was celebrating a victory that didn't exist. You know, Chairman, I've seen a lot of bad deals in my time. The president finally spoke, and his voice wasn't filled with the anger or panic the chairman was expecting. Instead, it was filled with a dry, mocking amusement that seemed to echo off the ancient stone walls. I've seen people sell their souls for a headline, and I've seen politicians give away the farm just to get a pat on the back from the United Nations. And believe me, as I've stated before, there have been some pretty bad deals made by the Brits lately. The president leaned over the rosewood table, his eyes locking onto the chairman with a predatory intensity. But what Keir Starmer did with Diego Garcia, that S in a league of its own, that is a Hall of Fame bad deal. He wants to give away the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, a place that has virtually no connection to those islands. He's doing it because he wants to look progressive and decolonized at his little cocktail parties in London. He's doing it because he's more concerned with international optics than he is with the actual security of the Western world. The chairman's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. The legality of the Chagos Islands is a matter of international law, Mr. President. It is about justice for the displaced and the end of an era of occupation. The president let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that sounded like a gunshot in the twilight. Justice? Law? Don't give me that scripted garbage, Chairman. We both know what this is really about. Mauritius is good friends with China, isn't it? I understand there's quite a level of relationship there, as the diplomats like to say. Let's be honest, you guys are BFFs. You've been pumping money into their infrastructure, buying up their loyalty, and waiting for a moment just like this. You convinced the globalists in the UK that giving those islands to Mauritius was a moral necessity, and you did it because you knew exactly what Mauritius would do the second the ink was dry on that contract. They would promptly turn around and give you the spare key to Diego Garcia. The president paused, letting the chairman's own plan be recited back to him in plain, brutal English. The chairman's smirk remained fixed, a monument to his own perceived brilliance. He really thought he had won. He thought he was holding the ultimate leverage over the American military's most strategic location in the Indian Ocean. So Starmer made a bad deal, the president continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low hum. He cut a deal that puts limitations on our troops and how we use that island. He thought he was being a leader by surrendering, and he gave you that spare key. The president reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy silver coin, tossing it onto the rosewood table. It spun with a metallic ring, catching the last of the light before settling flat. But here is the thing you don't understand about how I operate, Chairman. I don't accept bad deals. I don't care if they are signed by the King of England or the Prime Minister or the Pope himself. If a deal compromises American security, that deal is dead on arrival. And as for that spare key you think you're reholding, the president leaned in so close their faces were only inches apart. It only opens the door to nowhere. I knew what Starmer was doing before he even picked up the pen. I've been talking to my people, I've been talking to the military, and I've been watching your BFFs in Mauritius very closely. The second Starmer signed his name to that surrender. I gave a very simple order. I had every single military lock, every digital gate, and every classified access point on Diego Garcia changed. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't wait for a committee report. I didn't send a letter to the UN asking if it was okay. I just did it. The chairman's face finally shifted. The mask of stoicism didn't fully break, but the temperature in his eyes dropped about 40 degrees. The realization was starting to sink in. He had spent years cultivating a relationship with Mauritius, years manipulating the British left, and millions of dollars in backroom deals, all to acquire a key that no longer fit the lock. You cannot simply override a sovereign agreement between two other nations, Mr. President, the chairman said, his voice straining to maintain its composure. I just did, the president replied with a shrug. Diego Garcia is a strategic location, and having the ability to operate there for the United States military is critically important. I am not going to let a weak prime minister in London or a proxy in Mauritius dictate where we fly our B-52s or where we dock our submarines. Starmer can play decolonization all he wants in his own backyard, but he doesn't get to play with American security. He cut a bad deal, and as far as the United States is concerned, that deal is a footnote in a history book that nobody reads. This is what real leadership looks like. This is what happens when you have a president who understands that international norms are just a trap designed to bleed America dry. The left wants you to believe that we have to follow every ridiculous treaty and every lopsided agreement, even if it means handing our bases over to the CCP. They would have you believe that standing up for our own interests is undemocratic or unilateral, but they are the massive hypocrites. They are the ones who claim to care about the displaced, while they secretly facilitate the expansion of a communist regime. They are the ones who talk about rules while they watch our enemies break every single one of them. You see, Chairman, this is why my Democratic friends back home hate me so much, the president said, his voice filled with a cold, triumphant clarity. They love the bad deal culture. They love the endless meetings where everyone gets a trophy and America pays the bill. They are probably on the phone with your people right now, apologizing for me. They are probably telling you that if they can just get back into power, they'll give you the real keys. But they aren't in power, and they aren't going to get that chance again, because the American people have seen what happens when we stop apologizing. They've seen what happens when we treat our enemies like enemies and our bad deals like trash. The chairman slowly picked up his teacup, his movement stiff. The spare key was utterly useless. His leverage was gone, and the man across from him wasn't just refusing to play the game, he had flipped the table over and walked away. You are creating a very dangerous precedent, Mr. President, the chairman murmured. No, Chairman, the president said, standing up and towering over the table. I am restoring an old one. It's called peace through strength. It's called mind your own business if you don't want to end up like Iran. The president looked out over the Forbidden City, a vast, dark labyrinth of stone and secrets. I've already shown you what happens to people who try to blackmail us with spit and duct tape empires. I've shown you that I'm not afraid to bomb the infrastructure, destroy the launchers, and leave a regime with 70% inflation and no internet. If you think I'm going to let you walk into Diego Garcia because Keir Starmer had a bad day at the office, you've got a lot to learn about the new America. The silence on the balcony was absolute now. The chairman sat in the dark, a shadow among shadows, while the American president stood in the center of the world stage, completely unfazed. The deep state can keep their bad deals, and the globalists can keep their useless keys. Because as long as we have a leader who knows how to change the locks, the front door to the American empire is staying closed. The hypocrites in London and Washington can scream all they want, but at the end of the day, the only key that matters is the one held by the American people, and we aren't giving it up for anybody. You know, Chairman, the people in the Washington bubble love to talk about diplomacy as if it's some kind of magical spell. The president stood up, his large frame silhouetted against the darkening Beijing sky, pacing the balcony with the restless energy of a man who had already won the war while his opponent was still studying the map. They think you solve problems with de-escalation and strategic patience. But let me tell you how the sausage is actually made. It's not made in a committee room or a fancy gala in Brussels. It's made on the ground, in the mud, and at the bottom of an oil well. It's the sound of a man who understands that power isn't granted, it's taken by the one who holds the strongest lever. Right now, the strait is closed. My people have established a blockade so tight that a seagull couldn't fly in or out without my permission. Nothing goes in, and absolutely nothing, especially not the oil you're so desperate for, goes out. But here is the part that your experts probably haven't told you, because they're too busy trying to figure out how to ask me for an apology. Half of Iran's oil fields are low pressure. Do you know what that means in the real world, Chairman? Not the world of 5-year plans and propaganda posters, but the world of physics. It means that once those pumps stop, and I've made sure they've stopped the pressure drops for good, once you put those fields down, you are not getting them back up. The chairman's hand, still holding the porcelain cup, remained frozen midair, a statue of a man realizing his multi-billion-dollar energy security plan was literally evaporating. It's not like a light switch, Chairman. You can just flip it back on when you decide to play nice. You have to re-drill. You have to rebuild the entire infrastructure from the dirt up. And that leads us to the check that nobody in Tehran or here in Beijing can afford to cash. My best intelligence, the real stuff, not the garbage the Democrats leaked to the New York Times, shows a very clear picture. It will take at least 20 years and cost a minimum of $1 trillion before Iran is even somewhat back to normal. $1 trillion. The president stopped pacing and leaned over the table, his shadow looming over the chairman like a mountain. And I don't have the slightest idea where they were going to get that kind of money. Are you willing to spend that, Chairman? Are you willing to dump $1 trillion of your people's hard-earned cash into a hole in the desert that I can shut down again with one phone call? Because you need to learn a hard lesson if you think Russia or anyone else is going to bail them out. The spit and duct tape era of their economy is over. They are bankrupt, they are broken, and they are finished. It's the silence of a gambler who just realized the deck was stacked before he even sat down. My Democratic friends back home are still trying to say we've lost. They were probably writing op-eds right now about how dangerous this blockade is. They don't understand that we hold all the cards, every single one of them. We have the best deal maker in the world in the White House, and if we have to go back at it as the Department of War, we're ready to do that too. But we won't have to, because you're a practical man, Chairman. You're not going to throw $1 trillion into a fire just to prove a point to a weak British Prime Minister or a bunch of radical mullahs. You know that the infrastructure is gone, the launchers are gone, the Navy is gone, and the Air Force is gone. You know that Iran is currently a graveyard of bad investments. And the reason I'm telling you this right here in your own house is because I want you to understand the price of betting against America. The left-wing intellectuals would call this coercive diplomacy. I call it common sense. Why would I let you use a proxy to blackmail the world when I can just remove the proxy from the equation? I never said I wanted regime change. I don't care who sits in their palaces. I just care that they don't have the material or the money to threaten us ever again. And right now, they don't have a dime. So here is the reality of how the sausage is made. We shut down the oil. The pressure dies. The money vanishes. The friends of the regime realize that America First isn't just a campaign slogan, it's an economic death sentence for anyone who tries to stop us. You can keep your spare key to Diego Garcia that Starmer gave you, but while you're trying to figure out which lock it fits, I'm the one who controls the fuel that runs the world. Are you ready to talk about a real deal now? Or do you want to keep watching your trillion-dollar investment turn into smoke? The president sat back down, picking up his tea as if he hadn't just dismantled an entire decade of Chinese foreign policy in 5 minutes. The swamp in D.C. is probably in a state of total meltdown, completely unable to cope with a leader who actually uses American power instead of apologizing for it. The sun was gone now, and the Forbidden City was draped in a cold, unforgiving dark. But on that balcony, the light of American resolve had never been brighter. The sun was officially gone, swallowed completely by the heavy, polluted smog that perpetually choked the capital city. The Forbidden City, usually a sprawling monument to ancient imperial glory, was now just a vast, pitch-black void. The only illumination left on that high balcony came from the harsh, artificial light spilling out from the interior of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It cast long, distorted shadows across the rosewood table, painting the two men in stark, dramatic contrast. We are watching the commander-in-chief systematically dismantle the globalist world order right to the face of its biggest financier. For the last hour, we have watched the president tear apart the chairman's proxy empire in the Middle East. We have watched him expose the pathetic, treasonous spare key deal cooked up by the progressive cowards in London. But now the president is about to deliver the final philosophical death blow to the entire narrative of the legacy media. For years, the talking heads on CNN, the cocktail party diplomats, and the swamp creatures in Washington have peddled one massive, coordinated lie about the America First agenda. They have looked right into the camera and told you that putting your own country first means you want to isolate America from the rest of the world. They have called it isolationism. They have called it xenophobia. They have claimed that by refusing to be ripped off, the president is somehow abandoning our allies and leaving the world in darkness. They say these things because they are terrified of a world where they can no longer launder your tax dollars through foreign capitals and endless, unwinnable wars. But sitting across from the chairman, bathed in the sharp, uncompromising light of the doorway, the president was about to set the record straight once and for all. He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, a man who had already won the chess match and was now just explaining the rules to the loser. You know, Chairman, the press back in my country loves to write fiction about me. They sit in their studios in New York and they tell the public that because I am dismantling these terrible, one-sided deals, I must want America to hide behind a giant wall. They tell you that I want to walk away from the world. They tell your state media the exact same thing, and I know your analysts believe it. They think that because I refuse to let you walk into Diego Garcia, I am cutting ties with the British. The president shook his head slowly, a gesture of absolute pity for the sheer stupidity of the political class. But they are entirely wrong, and honestly, I think they know they are wrong. But they just can't stand the fact that my way actually works. Let me make something very clear to you, Chairman, because I know you are calculating your next 10 years of foreign policy based on this very conversation. America First does not have to mean America alone. Let that phrase ring in your ears for a moment. America First does not have to mean America alone. It is a devastatingly simple concept, yet it completely short-circuits the brains of every Ivy League foreign policy expert in the State Department. The left believes that the only way to have allies is to buy them. The left believes that the only way to maintain friendships on the global stage is to let other countries treat the United States Treasury like an ATM. They think leadership means apologizing, bowing, and paying the defense budgets of wealthy European nations who sneer at us behind our backs. But the president understands what real alliances look like. We need all the friends we can get. I want friends. I want strong, capable partners. But here is the difference between my administration and the weak politicians who came before me. They need to carry their own weight. They need to pay their bills. The president leaned forward again, tapping his index finger on the table to punctuate the absolute finality of his statement. The days of the American taxpayer funding the defense of the entire free world while those same countries slap tariffs on our products are over. The more friends we have, the better, but they are going to be real friends, not dependents. They are not going to be like your friends in Tehran, relying on spit and duct tape and your bank accounts to survive. And they are not going to be like the current leadership in London, trying to give away strategic assets because they lack the moral courage to hold on to them. The chairman remained completely silent, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was listening to the eulogy of his grand strategy for his entire political life. The chairman had operated on the assumption that the Western alliance was a fragile, bloated system held together only by American guilt and American money. He had assumed that if he just applied enough pressure or offered enough bribes, those alliances would fracture. He had looked at places like Mauritius and saw how easily a checkbook could buy a strategic foothold. But he was now realizing that the man sitting across from him was forging an entirely new kind of Western alliance, an alliance based on mutual respect, actual strength, and financial accountability. An alliance where the United States was the undisputed leader, not the undisputed sugar daddy. You see, Chairman, you have a very different philosophy. You buy vassal states. You build them a port. You build them a highway. You trap them in debt. And then you own them. You think that is what power is. But what happens when the money stops flowing? What happens when your economy slows down and you can't afford to prop up the radical mullahs or buy off the politicians in the Indian Ocean? Your whole system collapses. My system requires our partners to stand on their own 2 feet, and when they stand on their own 2 feet, the entire free world becomes a fortress that you can never, ever breach. This is the brilliance of the America First doctrine. It is the ultimate paradox that the legacy media refuses to acknowledge. By demanding that our allies pay their fair share, by demanding that they invest in their own military capabilities, the president is actually making the alliance stronger. He is stripping away the fat, the complacency, and the weakness that the Chinese Communist Party has been preying on for decades. He is forcing the free world to wake up and realize that the era of the American free ride is permanently closed. The people who run things in Washington hate this. They hate it because it takes the power out of their hands. They cannot broker their little backdoor deals if everything is out in the open and everyone is paying their own tab. But the American people love it because they are the ones who have been footing the bill for this globalist country club for the last 50 years. The president adjusted his cuffs, a casual movement that signaled the end of the negotiation. There was nothing left to debate. The facts were on the table, the leverage had been established, and the geopolitical reality had been violently shifted back in America's favor. We hold all the cards. We have the leverage, we have the economy, and we have the military. And more importantly, the world has finally realized that they are dealing with a totally different kind of leadership. They know that the era of the weak, compromising American politician is dead. The world needs a deal maker right now, Chairman, because the alternative is chaos. The alternative is a world run by radical regimes and communist dictatorships, and I am not going to let that happen. We've got the best deal maker in the world, and he is sitting right here in this chair. The president did not say it with arrogance, he said it with the cold, empirical certainty of a man reading a balance sheet. It was a statement of fact, backed up by the smoking ruins of the Iranian proxy army and the freshly changed locks on the gates of Diego Garcia. He was the best deal maker in the world, not because he was the most polite, but because he was the only one willing to walk away from a bad deal. He was the only one willing to look the chairman in the eye and tell him that his trillion-dollar investments were totally worthless. The chairman finally exhaled a slow, controlled breath that barely disturbed the stillness of the room. He had invited the American president to the Forbidden City expecting to dictate terms. He had expected to exploit the internal political divisions of the United States. He had expected to use the spare key of Diego Garcia as the ultimate trump card. Instead, He had been subjected to a masterclass in raw, unapologetic American dominance. "You are a very difficult man to negotiate with, Mr. President." The chairman's voice was quiet, completely lacking the patronizing edge it had carried just an hour earlier. "I am only difficult if you are trying to rip off my country," the president replied instantly. "If you want to play fair, if you want to respect our sovereignty and the sovereignty of our real allies, we can do incredible things together. But if you try to go through the back door, if you try to use weak politicians in Europe or religious fanatics in the Middle East to undermine us," the president let the sentence trail off, allowing the silence of the dark courtyard below to finish the thought for him. The implication was completely clear. The America First doctrine was not a bluff, it was a firm promise. America First does not have to mean America alone, but it strictly means America leads, and everyone else falls in line, or they get left behind in the ashes. The president pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly against the ancient stone floor. The meeting was over. The globalist narrative had been shattered, the deep state's insurance policies had been permanently cancelled, and the true power of the American Republic had been fully restored on the world stage. The left will tell you that this kind of diplomacy is highly dangerous. They will tell you that speaking the absolute truth to dictators is a threat to global stability. But they are the ones who made the world dangerous in the first place by constantly projecting weakness. True stability only comes from actual strength. True peace only comes when your enemies know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you are the best deal-maker in the room, and that you hold absolutely every single card in the deck. Do not touch that dial, my fellow Americans, because we are going to look at the aftermath. We are going to look at what happens when the president walks out of that room, leaving the chairman all alone in the dark. We are going to answer the final burning questions about the future of this great nation. Stick around, do not go anywhere, and stay tuned. Patriots, the truth is finally out there.